sky. "There'll be no landing at the lighthouse tomorrow," repeated Charles Tansley, clapping his hands together as he stood at the window with her husband. Surely he had said enough. She wished they would both leave her and James alone and go on talking. She looked at him. He was such a miserable specimen, the children said, all humps and hollows. He couldn't play cricket, he poked, he shuffled. He was a sarcastic brute, Andrew said. They knew what he liked best, to be forever walking up and down with Mr. Ramsay and saying who had won this, who had won that, who was a first-rate man at Latin verses. That was what they talked about. She could not help laughing herself sometimes. She said the other day something about waves mountains high. "Yes," said Charles Tansley. "It was a little rough." "Aren't you drenched to the skin?" she had said. "Damp, not wet through," said Mr. Tansley, pinching his sleeve, feeling his socks. Disappearing as stealthily as stags, the 8 sons and daughters of Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay sought their bedrooms, their fastnesses in a house where there was no other privacy to debate anything, everything. Tansley's tie, the passing of the Reform Bill, seabirds and butterflies, people. While the sun poured into those attics, which a plank alone separated from each other, so that every footstep could be plainly heard, and the Swiss girl sobbing for her father who was dying of cancer in a valley of the Grison, and lit up bats, flannels, straw hats, ink pots, paint pots, beetles, and the skulls of small birds, while it drew from the long frilled strips of seaweed pinned to the wall a smell of salt and weeds, which was in the towels too, gritty with sand from bathing. Strife, divisions, difference of opinion, prejudices twisted into the very fibre of being. Oh, that they should begin so early, Mrs. Ramsay deplored. They were so critical, her children. They talked such nonsense. She went from the room, holding James by the hand, since he would not go with the others. It seemed to her such nonsense, inventing differences, when people, heaven knows, were different enough without that. The real differences, she thought, standing by the drawing-room window, are enough, quite enough. She had in mind at the moment rich and poor, high and low, the great in birth receiving from her, half grudging, some respect, for had not she in her veins the blood of that very noble, if slightly mythical, Italian house, whose daughters, scattered about English drawing-rooms in the 19th century, had lisped so charmingly, had stormed so wildly, and all her wit and her bearing and her temper came from them, and not from the sluggish English or the cold Scotch. But more profoundly she ruminated the other problem of rich and poor, and the things she saw with her own eyes, weekly, daily, here or in London, when she visited this widow or that struggling wife, in person with a bag on her arm, and a notebook and pencil, with which she wrote down in columns carefully ruled for the purpose, wages and spendings, employment and unemployment, in the hope that thus she would cease to be a private woman whose charity was half a sop to her own indignation, half a relief to her own curiosity, and become, what with her untrained mind she greatly admired, an investigator elucidating the social problem. Insoluble questions they were, it seemed to her, standing there holding James by the hand. He had followed her into the drawing-room, that young man they laughed at. He was standing by the table, fidgeting with something, awkwardly, feeling himself out of things, as she knew without looking round. The others had all gone, the children, Minter Doyle and Paul Rayleigh, Augustus Carmichael, her husband. They had all gone. So she turned with a sigh and said, "Would it bore you to come with me, Mr. Tansley?" She had a dull errand in the town. She had a letter or two to write. She would be 10 minutes, perhaps. She would put on her hat. And with her basket and her parasol, there she was again, 10 minutes later, giving out a sense of being ready, of being equipped for a jaunt, which, however, she must interrupt for a moment as they passed the tennis lawn, to ask Mr. Carmichael, who was basking with his yellow cat's eyes ajar, so that like a cat's they seemed to reflect the branches moving or the clouds passing, but to give no inkling of any inner thoughts or emotion whatsoever, if he wanted anything. For they were making the great expedition, she said, laughing. They were going to the town. Stamps? Writing paper? Tobacco? She suggested, stopping by his side. But no, he wanted nothing. His hands clasped themselves over his capacious paunch. His eyes